It's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about some of the updated studies we're doing with glider diets. Actually, the last time I worked on these animals was about 10 years ago, and I'm very pleased to see the changes in the number of products that are on the market that I'm sure are contributing to better health of sugar gliders in captivity. So first I want to go through a little bit of background information, which I'm sure most of you are already very familiar with. They're aptly named animals in that they go for carbohydrates, but they're also not necessarily properly named because it's not just sugars that are in many of the foods that these animals eat in the wild. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. They are not insectivores. They're omnivorous. When they run into an insect or go searching for insects, they certainly do consume them. But that's not to say that they're the insects that are often fed in captivity, because there's a much bigger diversity of insects in nature than we typically have for feeding in captivity. But in general, the sugar gliders are consuming gums, saps, and nectars for energy. And there's a chemical difference between gums, saps, and nectars that hasn't been really looked at in enough detail to target exactly what is most appropriate for these animals. And they certainly do consume a variety of these carbohydrate sources. In nature, they're getting their dietary protein from consumption of pollen grains, as well as those insects that we've already talked about. And there's probably a big seasonality to it. Well, not probably, there is a big seasonality to that, and we'll look at that as well. Their teeth are designed to squish, to compress those insects, not break them apart. And they actually suck out the hemolymph, which is insect equivalent of blood, and the soft tissues, and typically discard the fibrous components. The studies that have been done in Australia really target a very specific use of local resources. So the location really does determine the foods they eat. And in a way, that's what we're seeing in a captive situation. It's the location, it's the feeder, it's you, the owner, that are determining the foods that they're being offered and what they're choosing. Is seasonality important? It certainly may be. We know, for example, that animals that reproduce during certain seasons often time that reproduction with higher levels of nutrients that are important for the growth of their young. For example, protein for birds in the spring here, similar perhaps for birds or for gliders in the wild, as there does appear to be a real seasonality to it. I don't know if it's as important to look at seasonality in a captive feeding situation. It's something that probably hasn't been duplicated much in most captive feeding situations, but it's something to consider. And as I said, there's a real variety in the types of plant exudates that are eaten. So we've got the nectars and saps. We've also got manna and gums and resins. Now, typically we think of resins as those hard, crunchy, dried out saps that are on trees when they've been damaged. And actually, they're called chinos scientifically. Gliders don't eat the hard chinos, but they will lap up resins, softer resins, and gums, saps, and nectars. And also they consume honeydew and lerp from insects. So insects like aphids, for example, that suck out the exudates of plant juices and then excrete extra that they don't need. It's called honeydew. And so this is kind of what they're going for often when they're consuming various insects. Lerp is also another excess exudate consumed by insects. Now these nectar saps and mannas are generally very sugary, very simple sugar. Sucrose, made of sucrose, glucose, and fructose. With about the fructose has about a 70 or 25% sucrose equivalent. So we need to kind of think about sugar metabolism and see if that's important in the overall health of these animals. I've not heard any reports of diabetes, but it's certainly something to think about and consider in the long run, long-term feeding of these animals. If these foodstuffs are high in sugar, they're typically very low in protein. So analyses that have been done have shown less than 1% nitrogen on a dry matter basis. Nitrogen is what's measured in a laboratory when you're looking at protein, and it's that nitrogen content is taken by about 6.25% typically for most feedstuffs that are typically used in animal feeds. So your crude protein content from those values would still be less than 6% on a dry matter basis. There's also some vitamins and minerals, but very low levels in those foodstuffs. Versus the gums, which are more of a complex carbohydrate, the polysaccharides, that form gels when they're put into water. Like Metamucil has a plant gum in it that makes a gel when it's in water. It's actually a soluble fiber source, and there are many health benefits to soluble fiber in terms of physical features for the gut, as well as some energy features for animals that ferment those fibers in the gut with microbes. Gums, again, range drastically in chemical composition. Those that have been looked at are from about 25 to almost 70% sugars. Go back. And also gleaning on the foliage. These stripes here would be gleaning insects from the leaves of the trees that they're living in. Branch licking is the right stripe, diagonal stripes. So they could be licking exudates off the branches themselves, or they could be licking insect exudates. Eucalyptus sap is the dark column, and acacia gums comprise the majority of the diet in at least 3 of these 4 seasons that were looked at. But if you're looking at the gleaning of insects, it's really mostly here in October, which would be the spring in Australia. At the next study that was done in Australia, in a different part of the country, again, you've got different food choices on a seasonal basis. So you've got nectars here making up the vast majority of the diet in June and July. These are the winter months when they're under some colder stress. It's not always hot in Australia. Compared to acacia gum, which was available only in April in this particular study. And insects in this study were only consumed in a fairly small amount during April and June of this particular thesis project. Eucalyptus flowers themselves, be it chewing on the flower petals or the pollens in the flowers, or the nectars and pollens combined, made up the vast majority of the diet through the summer months when those flowers were available to the gliders, and sap filled up the rest of the diet during these time periods. So you can see some huge differences in food choices depending not only on location but also on the time of year, what was available in the forest that the gliders were in. And this may be something we want to think about duplicating in a captive situation for diversity, for optimal health. Just hasn't been looked at in a lot of detail. Now, gliders themselves have a number of physiologic adaptations for dealing with some very dilute, nutritionally dilute feedstuffs. They have a pretty low gut passage for a very small animal, with a mean retention time on some of captive trials where they were fed pollen and honey of more than a full day. When they were fed higher levels of pollen, higher levels of protein, the passage was increased, so stayed in the gut a lot less. They have a very low basal metabolic rate, which most marsupials have a lower metabolic rate. They live in a low energy environment. But this really means that we have to watch very carefully the calories that we're feeding these animals. An animal that weighs, an average weight for these guys in the wild was about 130 grams, only needs about 11 calories a day, 11 kilocalories. And these are the calories that we work with, 11. That's like the number of calories in a single peanut. That meets their basal metabolic needs for the day. A 75-gram animal, which was the average of the 12 animals that I was working with in this study, only needed about 7 calories a day. It's tiny, 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 and it can easily be overfed. And they will eat it, just like we do. Now that's basal metabolic rate. That's just the energy it takes to keep your cells alive. Maintenance energy, where you've got normal activity levels, is typically about 1.5 to 2 times basal metabolic rate. So taking those numbers above, that 130-gram glider would need about 25 calories a day versus 15 for that 75-gram animal. If you're out in the field, running around, climbing trees, jumping around, gliding, field metabolic rate, FMR, goes up to 4 times basal metabolic rate. So you double that calorie need with high activity and searching for food. When we're providing this big bowl of food right in front of them, they're not spending a lot of time searching for food, so they don't need that high calorie input because they just don't have the activity. You know, it's just like us. When you're working out, you need more calories to burn off because you're burning them off. Now, gliders also have torpor. Up to more than half of the day they can spend in torpor, where their body temperature actually drops down and their metabolic rate slows even further. So they can deal with pretty cool temperatures by just shutting down a little bit and coming out of it when they're eating them. And this is typically in response to a low food availability. So if you've got poor quality food or low food availability, they'll shut down, but they won't die. But they really don't need very many calories at all when they're in a torpor state. Water turnover has also been measured in these animals, as you can see here on this slide. And I'm not really going to address water because it's just not much. And again, with lactation or growth of young, you need more protein because you're putting it into different body requirements or body needs. So up to 4 times more protein is needed in the diet at that time. When you look at the gut anatomy of a glider, you can see some very unique features. In general, it's got a really simple small intestine, which is where simple sugars and proteins are digested. Animals that have enzymes for dealing with simple chemical constituents of the diet, like simple sugars and proteins, have very simple small intestines. They've probably got a larger stomach for storing food and then getting back and hiding from potential predators. But what's really interesting is this very huge cecum at the junction of the small intestine and large intestine. So the cecum would be equivalent to our appendix. Our appendix really isn't used for much in the human body, but for animals that eat plant materials and have a microbial population to break down or ferment the complex carbohydrates in their diet, the cecum is the site of microbial fermentation and absorption of the breakdown products there. And the utilization of that cecum and the microbes in that cecum on different diets have really never been explored in the sugar glider. And this kind of gut anatomy suggests that it really can deal with complex carbohydrates much more than we perhaps are giving it credit for. So, with that little bit of background, you can see that there's some diversity going on in nature. But the bottom line is we can rarely duplicate those native diets, either diversity or the exact plants, or even the seasonality. But what we can duplicate are nutrients in those diets, if we know those nutrients. And we can also provide diets that are nutritionally balanced based on other similar types of animals that we know the requirements for. So whether we know requirements or not, specifically for the sugar glider, we can use information from other species that are similar physiologically to develop balanced diets. So, getting back to our first point, energy drives appetite. This is the bottom line for every animal, is calculating how much energy it needs. So, again, that 100-gram animal, average 100-gram, and I'm going here between my 130-gram and my 75-gram animal, so I'm just taking a 100-gram animal, requires about 17 calories a day with medium activity. And these are just the calculations to get there. That basal metabolic rate for keeping the cells alive, times 2 for activity, and then times that marsupial factor because it's lower energetically than a placental mammal. So it really only needs 17 calories. And with the protein, same thing. Plugging in my 100-gram animal, we're working with about 100 milligrams of crude protein a day. 4 times that if you're reproducing. But if you've got 100 milligrams of crude protein a day requirement, and the diet is, say, 10% protein, again, you only need to be consuming 1 gram of that diet, digesting 1 gram of that diet to get that 100 milligrams of crude protein. So it doesn't have to be very much, but these nutrients do have to be in balance, and they have to be balanced with that energy requirement, because once they fulfill their energy requirement, they're going to stop eating because they're not hungry anymore. So the other nutrients all have to be in balance with the energy concentration in the diet. That's how we develop and formulate diets. Now, some of the past and potentially present nutritional problems that we've seen with captive gliders, I think we are seeing much more obesity than we did perhaps in the past, due to just too dense a diets, too much food being offered to these small animals, maybe some inactivity, although these are pretty active animals. I have not seen reports of insulin or metabolic imbalances, but it wouldn't surprise me if some are out there due to the high sugar content of a lot of the diets being fed to these animals. I also have not seen very many reports of kidney disease in these animals, which often can be a result of excess protein being processed and just burning out the kidney, or sometimes it's due to imbalances in the building blocks of protein, specific amino acids, or sometimes it's due to too much or too little of specific vitamins or other supplements. So again, I'd like to hear more from the veterinary community and or the animal care community on specific nutritional problems that are being diagnosed currently. Tooth and gum problems. This may be a physical effect when you're fed a softer, sugarier diet. Sometimes you get more tartar buildup. And in this case, chewing on hard things, bark, if you will, like they do in nature, or even hard, crunchy nuggets like the dry foods, the dry pelleted foods or extrusions, can be a tooth cleaning kind of tool for these animals. Is diarrhea a problem in some of these animals? I've seen a little more soft stools with some of the softer diets. And the drier diets, I saw less diarrhea. And in this case, gums may also be helpful because those gums can actually absorb moisture in the colon, in the hindgut, and keep that diarrhea under some control. In say 10 years ago, we did see quite a bit more calcium deficiency and imbalances with respect to calcium and phosphorus. So you saw metabolic bone disease from, again, that lack of calcium. You saw tetany because calcium is important for nerve transmission and cellular function. And if the calcium was imbalanced with respect to phosphorus, you could see these problems. And we saw them because a lot of sweet, sugary produce, fruits and vegetables, fruits more so than vegetables, and specifically insects that were being overfed, are imbalanced in calcium to phosphorus. And we see exactly the same problems with birds, bats, amphibians that are eating insects and or produce-based diets that are not nutritionally balanced. So too much calcium is bad, but too little calcium is bad. You have to have a balance of calcium to phosphorus, and generally we're looking at a 2-to-1, between a 1-to-1 and a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus in the diet for any animals as optimal. So let's talk a little bit about veggies and fruits that are eaten by these guys. They do love them, certainly, and we can make up some very nice blended salads that work pretty well for them. They find them to be palatable, and they're consumed nicely. Now, one of the diets that I was looking at in this study was the HPW Guide Diet. And in this particular guideline, they provide about 3 different salad mixes for some diversity. So it's a variety of fruits and vegetables in specific quantities that are suggested. And if you look at these 3 mixes that are outlined by the HPW feeding guides, you see that in general they're very similar in nutrient content when you're looking at this on a dry basis. Now, recognize that all of these are about 90% water. So this is the dry matter basis is how we look at the nutrients in any of these diets, because that dry part is where the various nutrients are found. As you can see, there's very little difference across these. And these salad mixes work because they're pretty well balanced in general. Now, none of the produce is going to have vitamin A, because vitamin A itself is only found in animal-based foodstuffs. So plant-based are never going to have vitamin A, but herbivores convert carotenoid pigments, beta-carotene, to vitamin A in levels that they need. So these are very high levels of vitamin A compared to requirements of animal species for vitamin A, but I know they're plant-based vitamin A, just calculated based on the animal converting. Now there's a couple of things in these salad mixes though that did concern me when I look at them, and these are all calculated based on the ingredients that were provided. Vitamin C levels are really high. Most animals require about 200 milligrams per kilogram vitamin C, and almost all marsupials that have been looked at can make their own vitamin C, either in the liver or kidney. So I think that gliders probably also make their own vitamin C, but fruits and vegetables in general are high sources of vitamin C. May not be a problem, they might just pee it out, but high vitamin C can increase the absorption of iron. So if an animal is prone to absorbing too much iron and causing a condition called iron storage disease, one way of minimizing that problem is to lower the vitamin C or feed foods that are high in iron separately from foods that are high in vitamin C. We're not seeing that in these salad mixes. These iron levels are not excessive, but these vitamin C levels are very high. So in fact, there may be more iron being absorbed than we want. And in our last study, we did see some evidence of iron storage disease. The iron gets deposited in tissues that it's not necessarily supposed to be in. There is no vitamin D3 in plant-based materials. Animals make vitamin D from exposure to sunlight, through conversion in their skin from precursors, and or through get it through the diet. So since these guys are nocturnal, they probably rely more on dietary sources of vitamin D, but this absolutely has not been looked at all. But there is no vitamin D3 being provided through the plants in these salad mixes. But in general, these nutrients, as I said, are very similar across the three mixes, and they're all pretty well balanced. Calcium, 0.3 versus phosphorus, so you've got a 1-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 ratio. So the calcium to phosphorus levels are low, but so are probably nutritional needs of animals since they're marsupials, and they're in a good ratio. So I'm not worried about calcium phosphorus in these particular blends, and the rest of these look pretty good. But be assured that those mixes are quite similar across the three. Now, getting to another component of the diet, we're talking about some of the cubes or the gums, the glider gum or the nectar blends that are being fed. In general, these are made up to be about 70 to 90% water, so they're very dilute. But in that dry matter, in that 30 to 10% dry matter, very high in carbohydrate, but it's and mostly what we're seeing in the homemade blends or even in some of the purchased blends, they're very simple sugars that are highly digestible versus gums. So it may help to have some soluble fiber, which can have variable digestibility depending on how that hindgut works in these animals. And this is where I think we need to really start looking at adding the benefits of adding some soluble fibers to some of these diets that are being fed to these animals. In general, those nectars and gums don't have very high levels. They certainly don't have high levels of protein or fat, and they've got some variable levels of ash, which is where all your minerals are. Now, in other studies that have been done in nature, the gums have been found to be a good source of calcium that often balances out a lack of calcium in other foodstuffs. With other species, flowers, when they've been analyzed, and bark, when it gets consumed, have also been shown to be very good sources of dietary calcium. So we shouldn't discount those potential components of the diet, even for the sugar glider, as a source of essential nutrients. Now, these nectar blends that we used in the trials in this particular study, you can see there's some differences, but not so many. There's some difference in the protein content on dry basis, certainly a difference in the fat content between these two products, but in general they're fairly similar. There's some concerns I have with some of these products that are outlined here in red. Copper levels very low in both these, as are some of the other minerals specifically outlined here. So we probably need to look at mineral nutrition in a lot more detail. And the other thing that I noticed with these is that the water content varied somewhat, from 74 to 85%. So there's not real consistency in the thickness, if you will, of the nectars used in these trials. And I did find that volume measures are not nearly as accurate as weight measures. In the United States, we're good at using cups, measuring cups. but you can pack down a measuring cup, and so I saw some real variability when I would scoop some of the nectar powders to make that nectar blend, and so I really tried to be more consistent in exactly how much weight-wise I put in, not just a cup measure. Get a handle on nutrition. Now, insects, certainly they get fed to sugar gliders. They were not used in this study at all because I don't feel that they're essential at all for these animals for some of the reasons that I've outlined. In nature, they're highly seasonal, and the animals, the insects that gliders have been reported to consume are spiders and hard-shell beetles. They're not necessarily crickets and mealworms, so nutritionally they could be very different. All the insects are very high in protein. Some are very high in fat and fiber, but across the board, almost every single insect and life stage of insect is low in calcium and also low in vitamin A. Calcium and vitamin A deficiency are some of the main problems we see with insectivorous animals. We don't want to be contributing to that. Additionally, insects have a huge diversity in their nutrient content. Human populations that eat insects, some eat them for sugar content, some eat them for protein, some eat them for fat. So it really depends on which insects are being fed or consumed, which nutrients you're getting. Grazing insects, for example, silk moths, larvae, grasshoppers, stick insects, eat plant materials, so they're loaded with vitamin E, carotenoid pigments, fiber, and calcium. So if those are the nutrients that you're going for, those kind of insects would be providing that. The black soldier fly larvae is one insect that has a high calcium level. I don't know that it's ever been fed to the sugar gliders, but it's something that we might want to be looking at as a treat item on occasion because it's not going to contribute to the calcium phosphorus imbalance. And there's also even canned insects out on the market that may be palatable, and that processed exoskeleton could be more digestible. So keep that in mind, but always consider insects only a treat item. Now, when we're looking at other nutrients in the diets for these guys, the building blocks of protein are the amino acids. There are ideal ratios of specific amino acids that have been developed for livestock and pet species. So I'm looking at the amino acids in some of these diets in a lot more detail, and I'm not going to report it today because I'm still waiting on some of the lab analyses. But it could be important. For example, the amino acid tyrosine, which is an essential amino acid, it's not made in the diet, is linked with melanin or dark pigmentation. And so a lack of tyrosine or an imbalance of tyrosine may result in a color change, perhaps not as dark as it should be. Tryptophan, you've heard of this, leading to serotonin production in the brain, that you get that comatose state after eating poultry and turkey dinners. There's a very specific pathway for that. So certain amino acids can have effects. We know nothing about fatty acid requirements at all for these animals, and they don't eat high-fat diets, so they probably aren't relying on fats for a major energy source. And minerals, we know specific macrominerals and trace minerals that are needed in specific ratios by other species, and that's what we're using as models, because at this point we don't know what normals are for these nutrients in sugar gliders. With the trace minerals, there are, again, some possible links with color and iron storage issues. I mentioned iron, but copper deficiency can also lead to a bleached hair coat or a reddish colored hair coat. So again, if there's a problem in the hair coat, it's possible it could be linked with a trace mineral deficiency in the diet. The categories of nutrients: fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. I mentioned that they have to be converting precursors because the foods they typically eat don't contain vitamin A. In that case, a dog would be a much better model for these animals, an omnivorous animal like a dog, because we know that dogs will convert carotenoid pigments for vitamin A. Vitamin D we don't know much about. As nocturnal animals, they probably have a low requirement for it, but needs to be looked at in more detail. E and K they're going to get from the diet or gut microbes. Vitamin K can be made by gut microbes if indeed there are gut microbes, but certainly dark green leafy vegetables are very good sources of vitamin K and also the B vitamins here. And I already mentioned that marsupials synthesize their own vitamin C. Now I've heard that someone said vitamin K is bad for sugar gliders, and I don't know why. There's absolutely no evidence for that. So all of the fat-soluble vitamins are needed by all species in specific ratios, so we probably shouldn't discount them. Now the feeding trials that are in progress, just to briefly mention, I've got 12 gliders on 3 different diets, 6 males, 6 females that are pair housed. They've all got sleeping pouches that get switched out and washed weekly, and the cages get moved weekly in case there's an effect of sunlight on appetite. The 3 diets that we're looking at are HPW Complete, Glider Kids Low Honey Mix, as well as a Glider Chow diet. Animals are weighed weekly, and intake and digestion is measured with total fecal collection. So just looking at these 3 diets, this is the basic diets that were being fed. You can see there's some difference in the total calories that are being offered by the 3 diets. A little bit of difference in the protein content. Again, this is on a dry matter basis. And we've got some real variability in the fat content. So this will be very interesting to see if there's a difference in digestibility of fat across these 3 diets, because that one really does differ. In general, these 2 diets have similar calcium-phosphorus ratios, and diet C has much higher levels of both calcium and phosphorus, but the calcium-phosphorus ratio is still within what would be considered a normal or a good range. And this is just the diets that are offered. Animals may actually be consuming a diet that is different nutritionally than that being offered, because we know that they selectively consume. So these are just the shells and the fiber, the peels, empty pea shells, empty corn kernels. So they're avoiding that insoluble fiber fractions. They did eat quite a bit, about 7 to 9% of their body weight daily in dry matter intake. I saw a lot more urine and much darker urine from the carotenoid pigments in the salads on the salad-based diets versus on the dry diet where they drank readily from the water bottles. But in general, the fecals looked pretty much identical, so it'll be interesting to see what the chemistry is from these different diets, and that's how we'll determine digestibility. When I could, I would get fresh fecals and weigh them wet versus dry to see if there was a difference in what was going on in the hindgut, and maybe a 10% difference in water content between those on the dry diet versus those on the salad diet. But in general, it looked like this was normal physiology and normal gut function going on. I did see a higher incidence of diarrhea on occasion with the wet diets. I never saw it on the dry diet at all. And preliminarily, we have digestibility numbers from about 85% digestible for the dry diet to a little more than 90% digestible for the wet diet. We've got a lot more detail coming from the lab data when it comes back. So all the leftovers from the salads that were offered are being analyzed as well as the salad itself, so we can see if nutritionally they're selecting a diet that's different than they were offered, because then obviously we'll be analyzing something different in terms of what they're consuming. And I even picked up the leftovers after the pellet consumption, because they would always chew into those little dry nuggets and leave something behind. Are they actually just eating an external coating and dropping the middle? I don't know. If there's a chemical difference between what they're eating and leaving, then obviously we're going to have to factor that into their overall digestibility trials. And when I ground the fecals, I always got a big fuzzy component, regardless of the diet. And I don't know if it's inorganic or not. I'm hoping that they aren't chewing on their blankets and pouch fuzz and getting that into their feces. If it is, that means they might be going for some more fiber than we're feeding them. But it certainly isn't obvious on the fecal pellets, but when you grind them, it shows up. And the blankets and the pouches get washed regularly, so I know it's not just excess fuzz out there. In general, these animals were much, much calmer eating the dry diet. They loved it from the first minute it got put in their cage, and they always went for it over any of the nectar cubes as well. There may be a satiety factor, maybe it fills their gut, maybe it just stays in there longer, and they just don't get frantic, and they seem to sleep better. They did not wake up as readily. But they can gain weight very rapidly on that diet. So when we were going through the week of switching them onto it, I overfed them. So you can see on week 5 there was an increased weight on all these guys, so I really had to cut back and only gave a teaspoon of dry pellets per animal during the trial, or we had some weight issues. But they definitely showed a clear preference for it. It may be a crunch factor, I'm not sure, and it would be interesting to compare it with oral health of these animals. There need to be a number of additional studies done with captive gliders, I think. We still need to look at normal microbiology of the gut. I've got a colleague working on the microbiology with fresh fecals, so hopefully we can isolate some of that. And I'd love to see gum fermentation ability, following some of the things that I've mentioned throughout this talk, looking to see just how well they can digest some real gums in the diet. I'd like to see some studies, sugar types and glucose status in these animals, as well as blood mineral and amino acid normals. Again, looking at oral health and diet form, vitamin D metabolism, and also to see if there's any effect of seasonality in diets fed to these animals. If you see weights up and down and you're not changing the diets, then think about how seasonality may be affecting them. Perhaps sunlight is affecting hormones and diet and how they utilize foods. And so we might really want to think about taking that into account. There are still a number of enrichment ideas that can go along with diet to stimulate natural behaviors, feeding nectar through tubes, putting flowers in the diet, edible flowers, not ones that have been sprayed with pesticide, and certainly not any that have ever been shown to be toxic to animals, but stuff that's used in human culinary, like nasturtium, for example, or something like that. Might be interesting to see if they would go for it. Hiding foods, making them work for it a little bit, painting gums, making the nectars or gums thicker, and painting it on bark and letting them chew into it to lap it up can certainly stimulate natural behaviors. And lastly, I'd like to give special thanks to all of you for caring and providing funding to support the study and moving the care and health of these animals to the forefront, and to Shelley at Glider Nursery for arranging all of the logistics for this study as well as this workshop itself. Thanks very much.